Donald Trump will be doing whatever he can within the confines of federal legislation and federal executive orders to loosen restrictions on the exploration and exploitation of domestic energy deposits. And that will be paired with market incentives for green energy, but the emphasis will certainly be placed more on the exploration of fossil fuels and development of fossil fuels and nuclear technology.
Now, an American journalist, Selena Zito, wrote in The Atlantic magazine in 2016, when Mr. Trump won his first election, the press takes Trump literally, but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously, but not literally. He's probably the best guide on how to interpret Trump and stay sane. So let's look at him through that prism. Noah Rothman is a senior writer for the National Review. He's the author of The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressive Wars on Fun. Noah Rothman, good to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining us. Let me put this to you. The American right now belongs to Donald Trump and his worldview. It's not just the Democrats in denial and disarray. It's pretty much over, is it not, for the anti-Trump Republicans?
To the extent that, well, certainly in the framework of 2016 through 2020, the anti-Trump resisting the wall that he had promised in 2016. Now, in 2019, he tried to do just that and was blocked by Republicans in the U.S. Senate. Will be no resistance now. So in that sense, yes, there has, over the Christmas break, over December, to pass a stopgap legislation to fund the government, a lot of Republicans defected against his wishes, and that did not pass. So there are moments where you can see sort of an insurrectionary element among people who count themselves as Donald Trump's true friends. But sometimes politics intervenes, and even principle intervenes. So I wouldn't count that out.
So it could be on some fiscal issues where Donald Trump could face some resistance from what you might call his own side. He's not fiscally conservative. The U.S. deficit is almost $2 trillion. Now the national debt stands at $36 trillion. I don't even know what that means. And there's a danger that Mr. Trump, who wants to renew the 2017 tax cuts, then add to these tax cuts, and there's all sorts of other things he wants to spend on. And some of us are very doubtful that Mr. Musk will be able to cut that much from the federal budget. There is a risk here that he will be fiscally profligate and meet resistance from Republicans on Capitol Hill.
Certainly. And during those negotiations where Donald Trump and his own party sort of revolted among each other and scuttled this one initiative, they were working at cross purposes. The DOGE committee that you're talking about, a government efficiency committee, which exists outside government. That's the Musk one, yes. And it's not a governmental committee. This is sort of a blue ribbon commission outside of government. But they're saying, well, we need to cut government, right? We need to cut waste and inefficiency and maybe even retool some of the primary drivers of our debt and deficit, which are America's unfunded entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and the interest on our debt primarily. And Donald Trump, meanwhile, is saying, well, we need to raise the debt limit, which is a mechanism that stops Congress from spending spending recklessly and sort of confront what they're spending on and maybe pare back a little bit of those obligations. The debt ceiling has actually prevented the government from going, spending wildly and actually sort of pared back some of its priorities. So it is a useful mechanism, even though it's very rarely considered. But the two of them are talking past each other. One is saying we need to grow government. The other saying we need to cut government. And these two things are, obviously incompatible, but they haven't been reconciled in the minds of Republicans who support Donald Trump and supports Donald Trump's initiatives, of which DOGE is one.
We're going to get a blizzard of executive orders starting this afternoon, we're told. Some of them will deal with this whole DEI business, diversity, equity, inclusion. It's clear the Trump administration wants to roll a lot of that back wherever it can, not just in the public sector, in the federal government, or in the military. Would I be right in thinking that on social issues like that, the American right, if I can call it the old right, the new Trump right, they're pretty much united on that sort of stuff?
Yeah, but I think that predates Trump. I mean, this is a new species of what we used to call PC, or affirmative action, or higher quotas for hiring on racial lines. Americans have been hostile to that in the abstract for a long time, and conservatives and Republicans have been hostile to it forever. And it was a real costly error when the Biden administration embraced the concept of equity. It led them to do things that are at odds with the Constitution, like, for example, attempt to distribute taxpayer funds, relief funds, to Black Americans and only Black Americans, which is discrimination based on race which is prescribed in the 14th Amendment, and they got wrapped over the knuckles for it in the courts. It was a deference to an ideological objective, which is at odds with America's legal structure. That's the sort of thing that the president should be stamping out.
So on these matters, the new administration is pushing on an open door, or giving rocket boosters to trends that are already underway. You're saying that there's a rollback against DEI already underway in America.
And that's just the federal government that the president has control over at the lower level, the municipal level, and at the corporate level in private affairs. You're seeing a lot of these DEI enterprises, these offices that were designed to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, disappear in the absence of federal pressure. Once that pressure was taken away, these companies stripped it. And you can say there's people who support that will say, well, this is a reason why the federal government has to impose this, just has to impose basic principles of egalitarianism on these companies, because otherwise they will not do it. But the DEI initiative had become a self-sustaining racket long before these companies decided to slough it off. It is composed of individuals who are activists, who are in touch with activists, and who are paid off to get the activists off the back of these corporations. And very often they will invent infractions, and then these groups will come down around the shoulders of these organizations and promise to impose really ruinous liability on them in civil courts. Whether or not they win doesn't matter. They've taken them through the process as the punishment. They've taken them through the ringer in the courts. And then they avoid that by paying off well-connected people in the diversity, equity, inclusion industry. It is a self-sustaining enterprise that has become intolerable. And I think Republicans broadly, not just pro-Trump Republicans, anti-Trump Republicans, period, support efforts to liberate companies from what has become this extortion racket.
And do they broadly support what would seem to me to be pretty much the end of any kind of net zero strategy when it comes to climate change?
I think probably that's a fair assessment. I think net zero as a concept is toxic. I don't necessarily believe, however, that environmental considerations will disappear. What the president will be doing, the new president, Donald Trump, will be doing whatever he can within the confines of federal legislation and federal executive orders to loosen restrictions on the exploration and exploitation of domestic energy deposits. And that will be paired with market incentives for green energy. But the emphasis will certainly be placed more on the exploration of fossil fuels and development of fossil fuels and nuclear technology, and less on the subsidization of solar panels and electric charging stations.
It's interesting that for all the talk of the influence of the oligarchs, particularly the tech bros, that he plans to end subsidies for electric vehicles, which you would have thought wasn't particularly popular with Mr. Musk.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, also, but he's also leaning into the idea that we need to restrict the access of Chinese technology into this country, which was, by the way, a bipartisan initiative. Democrats did that too, because they're propping up a domestic industry that otherwise cannot sustain itself in the market. So now they need to protect the investments that they've made in a domestic electric industry and not allow China to undermine that, to create a whole bunch of electric car, new electric car vehicles, even if that's good for the environment, because it now conflicts with a protectionist policy in the United States, which is part of the reason why those of us who are skeptical of protectionism are skeptical of protectionism. It ends up being something that's easy to get into, but very difficult to get out of.
As I think we might be about to find out. Noah Rothman, we'll need to leave it there. Thank you for that.